Very sad day for baseball as the hit king, Pete Rose, has passed away. And there are some people in life that you just think will live forever. And I think Pete Rose was one of those for me. I grew up in Kentucky, Horse Cave, Kentucky, listening to Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall on the radio. And Kentucky was Cincinnati Reds country. And I came of age shortly after the Big Red Machine. And even though when I went to my first Cincinnati Reds game in 1980 at the age of 8 years old, Pete Rose was already gone. He was in Philadelphia at that time, but his presence loomed so large over Riverfront Stadium even then. And you could not be a baseball fan in the era that I grew up without having your life as a fan touched by Pete Rose. 83 years old at the time of his death. He was at a card show just on Sunday, signing autographs, which he loved to do, meeting people, and being Pete Rose. I said on X yesterday, Super Sky Point, to Peter Edward Rose, he was crass, he was selfish, he was full of shit. He was his own worst enemy. But nobody played harder. Nobody loved baseball more. Nobody won more games. And nobody got more hits. And he'll always be a Hall of Famer to this kid. Rest in peace, Pete Rose. I've tweeted about this many times. Pete Rose has been one of the athletes that I suppose, if there was a way to look at the statistics, I've tweeted about the most. I tweeted this just last year. I said, Pete Rose may be in, but is the world really a better place without him in the Hall of Fame? I think 33 years of twisting in the wind is a sufficient penalty. He's not Hitler. Let's fucking get over ourselves a little bit. And indeed, there are going to be those today who do not remember Pete Rose fondly. There are going to be those who focus on his deficiencies, and he had them. There's no question about it. But look at the accomplishments. Major League Baseball's all-time hit leader, 4256. He must have signed Hit King on 1 million autographs over the course of his life. He's the all-time leader in games played. He would be prouder to tell you that he was the all-time leader in games won in Major League Baseball. He said often that that was the statistic that he was most proud of. A 3-time World Series champion, of course, 75 and 76 with the Big Red Machine, 1980 in Philadelphia. He came into my consciousness in 1978 with his 44-game hit streak. I thought, who is this guy? He's incredible. 44 games in a row. At the age of 6, at the age of 7, that's the thing that superheroes are made of. And we could go on with his accolades, a 17-time All-Star, the statistical craziness that is his career, the idea that you could get 200 hits a year for 21 years in a row, and you're still looking up at Pete Rose on the all-time hit list. 4256. In 1985, chasing down Ty Cobb as the Reds player manager. I used to go to Reds games, and we would drive down Pete Rose Way to get to the ballpark. Pete Rose loomed and still looms large over Cincinnati, Ohio. And I think that it's a shame for those that are happy that he never got his opportunity to be a Hall of Famer in his lifetime. I suppose that your wish has been granted. He's no longer with us. Does it make you feel better to know that he never got that honor? Do you think that he should get in now? I always really disliked the people who said he's a Hall of Famer, but not in his lifetime. To me, that's a bigger fuck you than just keeping him out of the Hall of Fame. To say that you deserve the honor, but it should come after you're dead. Look, Pete Rose was his own worst enemy, as I've said. He lied repeatedly about what he had done. He didn't take responsibility for his actions. By the time he sort of kind of took responsibility for his actions, the damage to his reputation had already been done. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube at that point. And I think at some point, Pete realized that his life was going to be going to card shows and meeting fans, signing autographs. And he made that his own Hall of Fame. A lot of kids today probably don't remember, but Pete Rose was such a big deal in 1985 when he was chasing Ty Cobb's record. He got a phone call from President Reagan after he got that hit. But the hustle, look at the hustle. Pete Rose is going to be remembered best, even by the people that didn't fucking like him. Pete Rose is going to be remembered best for going 100 miles an hour all the time. His uniform was perpetually dirty. It was dirty the minute that the trainer handed it to him. Even when he was in his 40s, he was playing harder than guys half his age. And remember this about Pete Rose, if you remember nothing else. When you went and saw Pete Rose play, I could afford to go to one game a year when I was a kid. My mom would get me tickets to one game. And when he came back to the Reds in 1985, that was my first opportunity to see him play. Nolan Ryan pitched for the Houston Astros that night. It was an event. It was one of the most significant parts of my childhood, quite frankly. But Pete Rose, the way that he played, the next time you go to a major league game and you see some 23-year-old kid who can't run out a ground ball, remember the 44-year-old man that was running out his walks. Because maybe if he ran out a walk, he could force the other team into making some kind of a mistake, and he could turn that walk into a double. Maybe it would happen once every 2 or 3 seasons. But he did it every goddamn time just to create that opportunity. Pete Rose was all about winning. And the way that Major League Baseball is in bed now with all of the gambling services, it's going to look pretty silly to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren if the guy with the most hits isn't in the Hall of Fame because he gambled, when gambling is something that's going on the next at bat. If you can't already, you're eventually going to be able to gamble on whether the next pitch is a ball or a strike. Let's face it. Good luck explaining to somebody why Pete Rose isn't in the Hall of Fame in a few years. He should be there. I want to go to his last interview, a little bit poignant here as we know what we know now. Only a few short months ago, he gave an interview with Cincinnati.com. Let's take a look at an 83-year-old Pete Rose and his thoughts on.
Okay, I always keep my guard up. I always believe in baseball, and I believe somewhere in the future, baseball will give me a second chance. That's all I can go on. Okay? I hope it happens while I'm alive. I hope it happens while all my family's alive, because that's really what the Hall of Fame is about. Fans and family.
Do you think there's something that you could do about it at this point right now? Like, is there?
No, I don't think there's anything I could do about it except what I try to do. Keep my nose clean. Stay out of trouble. Be a positive person. Be a good public relation guy. And go around the country, which I do on a daily basis, and sell the game of baseball. I love the game of baseball. I worry about the game of baseball. I want it to succeed. I have 2 grandsons that someday will play in the big leagues. And I want them to be in the big leagues when it's really doing well.
Pete Rose, say what you will about him. He was an ambassador for baseball. He loved baseball. And until his dying day, he was out there meeting and greeting fans and attempting in his own way to contribute to the health of the game of baseball.
Hello?
Hello.
Pete Rose?
Yes, sir.
Alias Charlie Hustle?
Yes, sir.
This is Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Well, listen, I just wanted to say congratulations for breaking one of the most enduring records in sports history. Ty Cobb's career hit record of 4,191, and now, unless you've done something since I've heard the latest, you've made it 4,193. Well, I've been rooting for you, and come to think of it, I used to also root for the fellow who once held that record.
Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to call us, and we really appreciate it. And you missed a good ball game tonight.
Well, Pete, your grit and hustle have established you as one of the all-time greats of the game.
Well, thank you very much.
Your keen batting eye also has something to do with it.
Well,
someday your new record may be broken, but believe me, your reputation and legacy is secure, and I think it'll be a long time before someone is standing in the spot that you're standing in now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well, I wish you, the Reds, and the people of Cincinnati all the best. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Indeed, we ought to do this more often. You know, those of us who are in the middle of our careers can share tips on how to stay ahead of those younger folks who keep coming up on us from behind.
Well, if you'd have been here tonight, you'd know why we think this is the baseball capital of the world right here in Cincinnati, Ohio.
I can hear that you've got a few friends there around you, and I won't keep you from them any longer. But again, congratulations, and you've really given a lift to the whole country.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night, and God bless you.
September 11th, 1985, Pete Rose, 4,192 hits. The record books will tell you that Ty Cobb had 4,189 hits now. They took 2 away from him, but 4,191 was the number that Pete Rose was chasing all throughout that 1985 season, and getting a call there from President Reagan to Riverfront Stadium after he got the record. We are still battling some technical difficulties to get John Riggins on the program this morning, so hopefully we'll be able to talk to John Riggins a bit later in the program. But in the meantime, your consolation prize, America, is the international streaming star who joins us from Nashville, Tennessee, Ronnie T-shirts. And Ronnie, I tease you sometimes on this program about not being a big baseball fan in modern times, but I know that not only were you a baseball fan in the 70s, but you were a Cincinnati Reds fan.
Oh, 100%, man. I actually remember where I was the night he did that. I was just about to start my sophomore year of college, and probably the most famous bar and during that era was called Papa Joe's. And so my roommate and I, Tom Smith, went to Papa Joe's, sat in the second level, and we watched the entire game. And, because there had been a big lead up, and we were pretty sure that that was going to be the game, that it was going to happen. And at Papa Joe's in Columbus on the Ohio State campus is where I saw it. But yes, I've told this. I don't think I've told this story here. I know I've told you the story probably on our old podcast, but one of my fondest memories was I had bought a little transistor radio with just a little earpiece that just goes in the one ear. And my parents didn't know that I had purchased this. And I kept it hidden in this little box underneath my bed. And so every night I'd say goodnight and I'd go to bed, and then I'd get my little transistor radio and I'd put my earpiece in, and I would listen to Cincinnati Reds games until they were over. And that's just one of my fondest memories as a kid. And so, I mean, to this day, I can name, I'm not going to bore everybody with it, but to this day, I can name the starting 8 for the Reds during that era And I don't know if I know 8 baseball players today.
Yeah, I mean, same with me, my friend. I'm a little jealous that you got a few years on me. I'm not usually jealous that you're older than me, but I missed out on the Big Red Machine. I came of age as a baseball fan in 1978, and as you know, I was a big Reggie Jackson fan. And the first game that I ever got to go to, and the only baseball stadium that I ever got to go to until I was 20 years old, was Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. And as I said, I get to go to one game a year. And by 1980, they'd already broken up the machine. Pete Rose was gone. Tony Perez was gone. Joe Morgan was gone. They still had George Foster and Concepcion and Bench, but it wasn't the Big Red Machine anymore. And so I had missed out on that just barely. And you know what a big deal the Big Red Machine has been within the history of baseball, period. But particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, that was a huge shadow that they cast over the game. And I was always so kind of pissed off as a kid that I had just missed that. And I never got to see Pete Rose play. So when he came back in 84, when the Reds brought him back and named him player manager, that was a huge deal because I was going to finally get my chance to see Pete Rose. And so in 85, the following year, my one game, it was the Houston Astros. And I got really lucky because Nolan Ryan pitched that night. And I got to see Nolan Ryan face Pete Rose a couple of times. Yeah, I went back and looked at the box score this morning because Pete got a hit that night. He got a bunt single. So out of the 41-92, Ricky Cobb was there for exactly one of them. And it was a bunt single off Astros reliever Jeff Calhoun. I had to look it up, but it was a very big deal to finally be able to see Pete Rose wearing that Cincinnati Reds uniform and to watch him play the game. And that is a treasured childhood memory for me, Ronnie. And, as I said in the opening, there's some people that you just don't think about them dying. And of course, we're all going to, but Pete Rose was one of those guys that it just seemed like he would live forever, almost like he wasn't a real person. You know how some people get so famous that you almost see them as something more than what they are. And I think the Pete Rose that we're going to remember it's a lot like life, right? They say that the line between good and evil runs not between people, but it runs through each person. And Pete Rose was a flawed guy, and he made a lot of mistakes. And the person who suffered the most for the mistakes that Pete Rose made was Pete Rose. And then on the other hand, he brought us joy and he brought us incredible memories. And it was all a part of this complicated package that was Pete Rose. And it's kind of like you had to be there, Ron. I posted on X this morning, instead of doing the regular Why Not America's poll, I just polled the audience and asked the question, should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame? While we get the results of that poll up on the screen and look at some user comments, Ron, I assume that you are in the camp that thinks Pete Rose should be in Cooperstown.
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because I'm just not going to come out and immediately give that answer. It's something I think about, and I'm a big rules guy, right? And so there is that twinge of me that's like, well, there were rules and he knew them and he broke them. But there's also that common sense person in me that just knows at its core how stupid it is for athletic halls of fame to impose morality clauses. Like that's not what it is. It's how good you were as an athlete in that sport. And if you went and dug back into everybody that's in a Hall of Fame, gosh, Ricky, what percentage would you find that would have something that would make you go, well, they don't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. And I understand betting on baseball is different than other things, but I mean, he's the greatest hitter of all time, and it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing for the Hall of Fame not to have him in there.
Well,
Because,
he's the most prolific hitter.
oh yeah, sure, yes,
You
yeah.
know,
Not the best. He's got the most hits.
he's got the most hits, and what he did is pretty incredible. The comments that are coming in, you can see here. Do it. Say with the picture of Marge shot. The no votes are mostly Boomer and Gen X Cleveland Indian fans. Yes, says Knuckleball Craig. And there's a comment there in 2040, which is playing back to my tweet by Titletown Matt. A day late at this point, says Angry Hank. And you can see here the guy saying 13 people are wrong and dumb as fuck. Look, my audience might not be a perfect reflection of the overall American baseball audience, but there's certainly enough votes to get him over the threshold if it were up to Super 70 Sports Nation. And he is a WWE Hall of Famer, as Damian Passmore acknowledges there. This guy says it was a lifetime ban, and that's true. Jason Ciani says it's too early for these existential questions. And then Mike Harden, look, Mike Harden, I'll give you credit. You're being true to yourself. He says there's one rule you can't break. He broke it, game over. So Pete's dead, and that guy's at least going to stick to his opinion, which I think it's a pretty hard-ass opinion, but at least he has the integrity of not going back on it out of emotion. I think that if there had been evidence that Pete Rose had thrown games, I don't think that he should be anywhere near the Hall of Fame. But we don't have any evidence whatsoever that Pete Rose ever threw a ball game. And on top of that, Ron, it's antithetical to his personality. If we know one thing about Pete Rose, he was a degenerate in some ways, but he was a degenerate winner, and he was a degenerate competitor. And I just don't think it was in Pete Rose's DNA to lay down and lose a game on purpose. I really don't. And in a game where we've got, there are people who have done steroids that are in the Hall of Fame now. We can guess about who they are, but we know, there are some steroid users that are in by now. But we've still got Bonds on the outside, Roger Clemens on the outside, a lot of other players that are on the outside that otherwise would be in. So this idea of some kind of purity, it doesn't work for me when the guy bet on his team to win, as far as we know. It's been 35 years now. He shouldn't have done it. It was a big fucking mistake on his part. But having said that, is it something that should keep him out of the Hall of Fame for all eternity? I don't think so.
I think there's always lessons to be learned with everything, whether it's something that you do yourself or you're a witness to somebody else's situation. And you alluded to it in your opening. And I think the lesson you have to learn here, and I've just seen it over and over and over again, whether it's personal life, whether it's, with raising a kid, whether it's seeing other people, it's, man, if you do something and you admit it right off the bat and you're contrite and you apologize, it generally works out in your favor, and you definitely generally get forgiveness. And he didn't do that. And he was so obstinate about it for so long. And because of that kind of defiance, he made it almost impossible for the Hall of Fame to let him in. And I think that had he just owned up to it, taken his medicine, what would his medicine have been, Ricky? 4, 5, 6 year ban, and then let him in? But I don't know. You have to own up to it. And if you don't, you have to understand that the penalty is going to be way, way harsher if you don't own up to what you did.
He just kept digging the hole deeper for himself, unfortunately. And I think his friends felt the same way. The people who went to bat for him with Bud Selig and things like that. I think Mike Schmidt was one. Bench was another. Joe Morgan, I believe, tried to help him. I think they were frustrated that Pete kept making decisions that made it more difficult for baseball to justify welcoming him back. And unfortunately, it's true. Whatever his ultimate fate is, as far as the Hall of Fame, he is responsible for the situation that he put himself in. Here we see the tweet of Chad Pergram about Pete Rose dying at the age of 83. And I want to go ahead and bring Chad in now. He is the Fox News senior congressional correspondent. And on this day, perhaps more importantly, a lifelong Cincinnati Reds fan. Chad, good morning to you, my friend. Very sad day for myself, and I'm sure for you as well.
Yeah, I started to wonder about Pete's health in the past few years. I had watched the HBO documentary, read the book a few years ago, or a couple of months ago. And, somebody gets up to be that age, you just don't know what's going to happen with their health. But in some respects, I thought it was very fitting. My wife is a New York Mets fan. We had just sat down to finish dinner last night, and Pete Alonso grounded out to shortstop, the last out of the last regular season game played in the major leagues. And the Mets post-game show was still on the air. And mind you, I saw the note about Pete Rose, and I said, well, that's only fitting. That's Pete. He would always play in, as you well know, 162 games. He made it through the regular season, all 162 games. There was definitely a parallel there when I saw that note about Pete Rose.
Absolutely. Well said. Pete Rose was an Iron Man. He didn't have the streak that Ripken had, but you could count on him to be in the lineup every day. My producer sent me a note this morning that between the ages of 32 and 41, Pete missed 4 regular season games.
Yeah, in fact, I remember him missing one of those games. It was the second game of a doubleheader against the Expos, who I know you also kind of like. This was in May of 1978, and I was listening to the radio, and I remember Marty Brenneman, who was the play-by-play man, saying, well, Pete Rose is not in the lineup here. We're told it's a stomach flu. We're not sure if that's in fact the case, but I remember as a 9-year-old kid thinking, why is Pete not in the game right now? That was pretty remarkable because he just did not miss those games. And again, when you talk about what he achieved, the one thing that I always found just so prolific about Rose, and he would tell you this too, 4,256 hits. If you got 200 hits a year for 21 years, you would still be 56 hits shy of Pete Rose, which is just staggering. Nobody has as many 200 hit seasons as Pete did, when he was playing. That's just a staggering amount of base hits.
The total package, the ability to switch hit and hit for such great contact, to always be in the lineup. Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see anybody get 4,000 again in our lifetimes, Chad. Take me back, man. Take me back on a personal level. I know that you got to know Pete through the years. You covered Pete, and obviously we're a huge fan before that. Just on a personal level, can you talk a little bit about what Pete Rose has meant to you as a fan and as an adult?
Yeah, well, I think this was kind of bookends in my life. He was kind of my first hero, my first sports hero. I grew up in southwestern Ohio, and these were the days of the Big Red Machine, and everybody liked Joe Morgan and Johnny Bench and Pete Rose and Dave Concepcion and Joe Morgan. And that was life in Cincinnati. They were arguably the best team of all time. And so that style of play was kind of inculcated into the way I played baseball as a kid. I was little, I was scrawny. I realized the way Pete Rose played and tried to say, I'm not the biggest guy out there. I can out-hustle people. I can outrun them if I run harder. I can play smarter baseball. And then I had the opportunity. This was kind of a weird situation how this came up. This was in the summer of 1985. And I grew up in Jacksonburg, Ohio, which is north of Cincinnati, the smallest incorporated village in Ohio. And across the road is the Cox Farm, home of James M. Cox, who was governor of Ohio and the Democratic nominee for president in 1920, and Cox newspapers and all that, if you remember that. Well, the caretaker there came across the road. This is in July of 85, mind you. And this guy wasn't much of a baseball fan, Ralph Schramm. And he says, Cox has given me 20 tickets to this game on September 11th this fall. Would you guys like to go? We said, sure. So you get later into the fall, and Pete Rose is chasing Ty Cobb. And I played on the Edgewood High School soccer team, and this is the only time I was ever happy that Pete Rose did not get a hit. We played our game, we lost, and then we came out and turned on the car radio, and Pete Rose did not get a hit. He was still tied with Ty Cobb, and we had 20 tickets to this game on September 11th of 1985. So we took pretty much the entire soccer team. And actually, Ricky, if you look at the tape on ESPN, because they telecast the game that night, they pan through the crowd. You won't know who we are, but we are in the broadcast a couple of times during that night. And probably the one or two best sporting events I have ever seen in person. The Reds beat the Padres 2-0. Pete got a hit, a single to left, and then scored both runs that the Reds had in that game. I scored the game, and actually years later got Pete to sign the scorecard, and then got John Dowd, who composed the Dowd Report, of course, and then threw Pete out of baseball, to sign that document as well, that scorecard. I believe that's the only piece of paper that exists that has both John Dowd's signature on it and also has Pete Rose's. And I thought it was interesting a few years later that John Dowd, of course, became President Trump's attorney. This was during his first term. And then when Dowd left, who did they bring in? This guy to be the attorney for Donald Trump, and his name was Ty Cobb. You can't make this stuff up, but that's just one of those weird things. But we were there the night that Rose broke the Cobb record.
Well, Chad, your victory that night was my defeat, because my family, we had tickets to the September 12th game. And I, like you, I was watching the game that night hoping that Pete would take an over. Probably one of the very few times in my life that I ever cheered against Pete Rose. And of course, he got the hit. I think he got it in the first inning.
Yeah, it was the first inning. It was to left field. Absolutely. And I think that kind of helped the night, because he got it off the table. He scored both runs in that game. I remember they brought in Ted Power to get the save. Tom Browning, who passed away about a year and a half ago, he was the starting pitcher, a rookie that year, won 20 games for the Reds that year. That was quite a night in Cincinnati. And other than seeing some World Series games and a basketball game here in Washington, the Stanley Cup Finals, I think that's probably the best sporting event I've ever seen in person.
When it's all said and done, do you think eventually they will restore his eligibility to at least be voted on? And one other question for you, Chad. 50 years from now, this is you can give whatever take you want, because you won't be around to be criticized for it if you're wrong. 50 years from now, what do you think the enduring legacy will be of this very complex individual?
Well, we still talk about the 1919 Black Sox. There's no reason why they wouldn't in 50 years or in many years past that still be talking about Pete Rose. I mean, I always talked about when they discuss, the steroid era in Major League Baseball, and McGuire and Sosa and some of the others, should they be allowed into the Hall of Fame? The thing I always say is that the only thing Pete Rose ever took was an extra base. So you put his stats up against anybody else's. I remember covering this. Now, a lot of people might not know this. I was a kid reporter. I worked for WKRC Radio in Cincinnati when I was a college student at Miami University, and covered the Pete Rose, saga and him getting expelled in 1989. And the one thing that struck me was that Carl Rubin, who was a federal judge in Cincinnati, he wrote a letter to Major League Baseball. This was a federal judge, mind you, and declared that he thought that baseball, his word, had a vendetta out for Pete Rose. I mean, this was amazing to have a federal judge infuse himself in this, and said that he thought that Pete Rose, was Cincinnati's first citizen. A lot of people who aren't from Southwest Ohio, weren't raised on the Big Red Machine, they don't get this about Pete Rose. This was something that came up in the HBO documentary, where they were talking to Al Michaels, who was the voice of the Reds in the early 70s, and then Marty Brennaman. And they said, this was a team full of stars. And there was Johnny Bench, who is one of the best baseball players of all time, but he would never be the most famous and the most popular player in Cincinnati because he was not from the west side of Cincinnati. And another thing that always stuck with me in this, Ricky, is the night that they threw Rose out of baseball. I went back to the station. I covered the news conference at Riverfront Stadium where they named Tommy Helms, who had played for the Reds and had been the first base coach. In fact, was the first base coach when Rose broke Cobb's record there. I went back to the station, and we were trying to think of other angles of the story. And we had an old Rolodex by the news desk at WKRC, and I went through it, and there was Bob Housem's number. Now, Bob Housem was the architect of the Big Red Machine. He was the architect of the St. Louis Cardinals, the great teams they had in the late 60s, and then came to Cincinnati and built the Big Red Machine. And Housem was kind of known as this upstanding moral guy. He didn't allow the Reds to wear facial hair, no special cleats from Nike or Adidas. They couldn't wear the stirrup socks. It had to be, show a lot of red, a lot of conformity. Gave out straight A tickets if you got straight A's in school to the kids. And so he was pretty offended at this road that Pete had gone down. And this really bothered him from a moral standpoint. But then he said something to me which has always stuck with me. And he said, it diminishes the Hall of Fame if you have the person who has the most all-time career base hits not a member. And that's something that has always stuck with me. And there's almost a Shakespearean quality to this entire thing, too. Just a couple of weeks after that, again, as I said, I was a student at Miami, and I had an English class, and it was the Friday before Labor Day, and the professor had handed out some things for us to read that weekend. And one of them was this essay by Bart Giamatti, which is the famous essay about baseball he wrote when he was the president of Yale. And I took it home and I read it. And that night, Bart Giamatti died. And a lot of people think that there may have been a gentle person's agreement between Rose and Giamatti, and that, the stress of the Rose case, might have killed Giamatti. He died on Martha's Vineyard. And I remember that night, so I finished class and I had to go to work down at WKRC, and I had never heard of this piece of literature by Giamatti. And I went back out to the car and got in my book bag and brought the thing in and read a couple of lines from the story about it, because it's a great essay about baseball. And the key line to the story as it starts is, it will break your heart. It's designed to break your heart. And that's the essence of baseball. And that's really the essence of the Pete Rose story, frankly.
Very well said. A lot of broken hearts today for those of us that grew up watching Charlie hustle. Chad, we got to get you back on the program to talk baseball under happier circumstances sometime. Please come back on with us in the future, and we can do that. But really appreciate your thoughts on Pete Rose today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Congratulations on the new show. I'm a big fan.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Hey, OutKick fans on YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button and make your way over to OutKick.com, where you can watch the full episode.